Hi folks, Will from MinIO here, and today we are talking with one of our executives. Satish, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing great, Will. Great to talk to you.
Fantastic. So, I know that you do a lot of work helping folks get their environments up and running, their deployments up and running really well. What is the most common mistake folks make when they're deploying MinIO at scale?
Good question, Will. So, I'll keep mentioning this throughout this conversation, but the reality is because MinIO is so easy to set up and run, that customers don't take into account that that's the easy and simple part. The real work is in operations, and make sure that you're setting yourself up to continue to work as things go through. So you need to plan for the deployment. To start with, object stores are really about throughput. So you want to try and plan for that, right? We want to plan for what the capacity of that cluster should be for the foreseeable future. And that could be 6 months, a year, it doesn't really matter. Plan for what you want the throughput to be, right? How many gigabytes per second do you want the cluster to be managing? And then once you have that, then you can pick your types of drives, your NIC card capacity, how many nodes you want, etc. to manage those. The last part is things are going to fail. That's reality. That's also job security, but yes, that's reality. So you need to plan for those also and make sure that you have enough tolerance to allow for certain things to fail and go back in there. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. So that's one part of it, just setting MinIO in place. But the reality is you actually have to get it to set up inside an entire ecosystem. So make sure that you have, you're able to gather your metrics using Prometheus or whatever solution you have of choice. Make sure you have a place for your audit logs to go in. So it's just more than just metrics, who's accessing what, etc. Then you can add bucket notification, etc. If you do have encryption, make sure that you have access to your key management system, whether it's internal or external. Make sure you have that and set up and you have the credentials set up. If you're doing things like setting up replication or any of those, make sure you have your load balancers set up to handle those. And depending on the environment, whether if you are doing bare metal, Kubernetes, make sure you have all of those in there. But those are all the things you set up before you start, so you plan up all of these. There are also other things, which we have learned at the OS level, which says, be prepared for that. Use a kernel of 4.x or more. If you have 5, that's fine. How does that translate to versions? That could be a Red Hat 8 plus, an Ubuntu 20 plus, Rocky Linux 8 plus. But if you can do 9 or 22, it's better. And turn off things like audit logging, because that just doesn't help at all for systems, and it just slows it down on the disk side of it. It's good for others, but not for us. So those are the some of the things we tell them when they go back in there. Plan for this before you go in, because once it's running, you really cannot change the wings once the plane's flying. So be prepared for that.
Wow. So the MinIO deployments have just all these different dials that we can turn to really tune into the needs of an organization. So what are some of the lessons that we of MinIO have learned along the way, though, when we're setting these things up?
Yeah, so we've tried to make this so that out of the box, it should work for, many smaller deployments and not that. But the reality is, as you mentioned, we do have all the controls that you need to allow for a more efficient usage of MinIO. That's the correct way to go back and take a look at it. Also, we're an enterprise software, which means we need to fit into the ecosystem, not into the enterprise ecosystem, as opposed to being the other way around. So we need to get back in there, and we work with commodity hardware. So, so for us, we have to make sure that you have all the bells and whistles and tweaks that you need to make sure to get it in there. As I said, out of the box, it works, but go back in there. So what have we learned around this path, right? Hard drives, they're definitely, from a capacity and a cost perspective, they're great. They're also really good for large files. They're great if your number of IOPS is not that high. And so that's the use case for using them. If you do have smaller files or a large number of IOPS, then use SSDs or NVMEs, because that will give you what you want to come back in there and do. And it's actually, if those are the case, you'll actually realize that it is more cost effective, even though a per unit price might be higher. It's actually more cost effective to go through solid state drives. Also, because of just sheer physics, solid state drives are more consistent in performance, right? In spinning disks, depending on where the data is it'll be faster or slower. That's the normal physics characteristics of a hard disk. So those are things you learn. And so, you can live with those and go back into there. You can create hot tiers, cold tiers, but at least know what you want your performance and throughput to be and choose accordingly. Also, if your data is really small, just say, a few tens of kilobytes or even in the kilobyte range, then reduce your erasure stripe size. It'll work perfectly fine, but what happens is otherwise you get what's called write amplification, and you unnecessarily stripe these small files across these. So part of what we ask, when we go through this, when we onboard customers, we work with them to understand not only what's their capacity, what's their throughput, what's their use case, what's the average file size. We will work with any of them, but what we want to do is to allow them to be able to efficiently use their infrastructure. The other things which people don't think about is, they say, okay, well, you support replication. We are among the few that support active-active replication. We can do it not just two sites, we can do it multi-site. But that requires more bandwidth because it really needs to cross the network. So, you take into account not just the client traffic, but also make sure you have the replication bandwidth to go back in there and do this. We also ask that you constantly keep looking at your applications to see if you're making expensive S3 calls. There are less expensive, whether it's a read or a head call, and then you have expensive ones which are list or really getting large files or doing a lot of these objects. So constantly kept looking at that. Look at your lifecycle policy management. Make sure that you're cleaning up old data. We've had customers who sometimes had tens of thousands or actually even nearly 1 million versions of an object and didn't even realize that they had this. So, so all of that's available of how you can set these policies up. So, make sure you go back and do that. The last one is actually one which is constantly being asked, which is, how do you expand and what's the best way to expand MinIO? So in reality, there's really no limit, but we expand in what are called pools, which is a set of servers. We recommend that that pool be as wide as possible for two reasons. One, you get better performance. We're truly a distributed system, which means you can hit any server and you can still get the objects, so you get a much better IOPS that way. Also, you get a much higher efficiency, right? The larger stripe size, you can get a much better efficiency. You can get up to 75% efficiency. So what we explain again to them is, when you want to grow, don't think again, as I talked about in my first question about foreseeable future. How do you expand for the next 6 months, 1 year, so that you have actually a wide enough pool that you can go back in there and take advantage of it. So again, we are all about the operational side of things. So we keep saying, take a step forward, because you can. The good and bad part about MinIO is you can do everything, but doesn't mean that you should. So, part of what we try and help you do is, what should you be doing?
I actually had a question on another video asking me, can I do this? And I said, sure, but maybe you shouldn't. And
right. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Doesn't mean you should. One of the things you mentioned there with lifecycle management, these lessons really do influence our product as well. I know that MinIO really isn't a roadmap-driven company in the same way that you might think of. So when it comes to our product features, what does drive that next big thing that we're looking at?
That's a good question. So I think the way you positioned it is right. Let me try and clarify. We don't publish a roadmap based off of what we think customers want. There's some innovation which we go down along that path. We make sure we are very compliant with S3 because we want to make sure nobody is locked in. Right, so we extend it, we expand it, but we're essentially S3 compliant. So, but what we constantly innovate on is on two axes. First is what do customers ask for. This is really critical because we think the real value of MinIO is when it's actually being used. So, what are customers doing? How are they going down that path? It also allows us to respond quickly, right? So, engineers and everyone know that customer requests are higher priority than anything else that they are working on. And so that drives it. But that's allowed us to really innovate and stay far ahead of the market, right? We actually did multi-site replication before anybody did because a customer asked for it, but not, and we do active, we do active passive, you can do DR, you can do any of those. So that came actually from one of our telco customers which said, can you go back and go do that? We found that the most common use cases were applications like Spark, which are not version aware, and so they will keep writing the same thing over and over again. And so you end up again, as we said, with these thousands of versions. So we introduced this feature of being able to turn off versioning for specific prefixes. So now you can actually run Spark applications and all those temp files just don't load up and get your system and then get replicated across. So just the problem just multiplies. Some of our large media customers needed fan-out capabilities, which again, nobody has and available. And so we introduced that. We be introducing things like standalone key management systems because, again, customers don't want to go outside to go get those. Some of the other interesting ones we have to go work with is trying to figure out how to solve customers' supply chain issues. So right now, it takes quite some time to get hardware, and it could be drives, etc. And so, how do you handle failure and you go back and go do that? But sometimes it becomes even bigger. So let's just say a customer brought 12, wanted to buy 12 servers, and one server was dead on arrival. Now, the problem is it will probably take another 1 to 2 months for that server to come in. So now you can either do one thing, start with 11 servers, and then when that next server comes in, say, okay, maybe the next pool I'll add it or do something. Or what their ask was, can we start with 11, assuming there's a 12th one which has already failed? And we said, yeah. So these have got nothing to do with MinIO. It's just got to do with supply chain issues. And so, so those are the ones where we've gone in there and said, even though it comes in from there, but it makes it highly resilient. It allows people to plan even when they have, these kinds of unforeseen issues, which is, really outside their control, and their suppliers struggle with this. So that's where you see a lot of these coming in from from what the customer requests are. The second part is, again, going back to operations. How do we make it much more resilient, right? When hard drives fail, it goes down, nodes go down. I think we're pretty good at that. But then we have new issues. For example, some new drives, the drives suddenly slow down. So it's not down, but it's affecting performance because suddenly these disks are not meeting their SLAs. So we introduced a feature which actually you can set a deadline. And effectively, we will take that drive offline until it meets its SLA. It'll stay offline, and you can go back in there and do this, right? So those are things that we add in there to come back in there and do this. And even if you take a look at our application, even if you do synchronous, if for some reason the network breaks, it'll automatically switch over to asynchronous replication. So we handle all of these, if one server, if the replicated server comes back up and it still hasn't finished syncing, it will still proxy that request and get it from the other cluster. So those are all the things we do because we know you want to have business continuity. We're adding a lot more work on the observability side of things. So trying to make sure that, you get a lot more on the proactive monitoring side. We already have everything with Prometheus, with audit logging, but we're continuing to add more and more into the observability side, and adding more, features that customers want and they're looking for, which says, can you add rate limiting? Because otherwise we see constantly, everyone sees the good and bad part about having your own infrastructure is you can flood it. You can have a rogue application which just takes over everything. And so, traditionally we assumed, you could go through and you can use firewalls and go back and do that. But all of these are in different groups. So just trying to get one group to get some other group to go back in there and do this becomes difficult. So now it's easier. And that's the right way for, infrastructure to be run, right? Each of those there's a separate group which is responsible for networking. And so now you got to go back in there and do this. So these are all the things that we go in there and keep adding in to make sure that there is, from an operations standpoint, you have a lot more that's capable of, because that's where you spend most of your time. And as soon as these systems go down, because we're in financial services, we're in telcos, we're in media, we're in high tech, we're in large security companies, so they can't afford to go down. So the idea of how do you continue to keep it up and be able to scale at those rates, those are the things that we actually focus on as part of our roadmap. So.
Wow, that's fantastic. I personally have super enjoyed working at such a customer-focused company. Well, Satish, I don't want to take too much more of your time today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Will. This was a pleasure chatting to you.
All right, thank you. And for those of you watching at home, if you'd like to reach out with us, you can use any of the methods you see here on the screen. You can also chat with us interactively on slack.min.io or just leave a comment here on the video. Thanks so much. We'll see you for the next one.